When a girl is murdered beneath a London streetlight as 20 silent witnesses watch, Miss Marple uncovers a web of fear, corruption, and a protector whose darkest secret hides in plain sight. Welcome to the Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I am so glad you joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lover from all over the world. Miss Marple and Murder Beneath the Streetlight. Chapter 1. The Streetlight and the Shadow. The evening had folded itself neatly over Brookmere Lane, a modest stretch of cobbled road tucked behind the tram lines of North London. The air carried the smell of fried onions from a nearby cafe, mingled with the faint scent of petrol and dust. The street was the sort of place that looked harmless, a narrow slice of suburbia where life proceeded in polite monotony. But that night, as the clock in St. Matthew's Church struck 8, the quiet began to feel unnaturally tight, as though the street itself were holding its breath. Under the flickering beam of an old iron street lamp, 2 figures stood half in shadow, half in its sickly yellow light, a boy and a girl, Samuel Reed and Lydia Grant. Passers-by, in their evening haste, noticed them only for a moment, a quarrel perhaps, or a lover's tiff. Nothing unusual. Lovers quarrelled in London every night, didn't they? And yet, had anyone paused, even for the span of a single heartbeat, they might have seen the tension coiled in the boy's jaw, the fear trembling through the girl's fingers, and the glint of something cold in his hand. But no one did. A bicycle rattled by, its rider humming a careless tune. A milk cart trundled along the opposite lane. Curtains twitched faintly in second-story windows, then stilled again. When Lydia's soft cry broke through the air, quick, sharp, and utterly human, it was smothered almost instantly by the city's endless hum. A dog barked once, uncertainly, and somewhere down the lane a kettle whistled, and then silence. The street lamp buzzed, blinked once, and steadied. Its light fell upon the lifeless shape of Lydia Grant, 16 years old, lying face up on the cobblestones. Her left hand reached slightly toward the curb, her palm open as though still expecting mercy. The shadow beside her, Samuel Reed, stood motionless for several seconds before vanishing into the dark, leaving only the echo of his footsteps behind. The next morning dawned with an indifferent brightness, as London mornings often did. The early sun poured through lace curtains and across the breakfast table of Raymond West, novelist and nephew to the remarkable Miss Jane Marple, who sat opposite him with her usual neatness, silver hair perfectly pinned, teacup poised, knitting resting beside her saucer. Raymond was deep in his newspaper, frowning. "Dreadful thing, Aunt Jane," he muttered. "A girl murdered, stabbed, they say, right in the street near the corner of Brookmere Lane, practically in front of everyone. The papers are calling it the streetlight tragedy." Miss Marple lifted her gaze, pale blue eyes thoughtful behind her spectacles. "In front of everyone?" she repeated softly. "Oh dear, that's rather a phrase, isn't it? It usually means no one truly saw anything." Raymond gave a dry laugh. "You sound exactly like one of my detectives." "My dear boy," said Miss Marple mildly, stirring her tea, "detectives are merely elderly women with notebooks, only less observant." Later that morning, after Raymond had gone out to fetch his publisher's letter, Miss Marple remained seated by the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The newspaper lay folded beside her, its headline glaring up in black type. "Murder beneath the streetlight. Young man arrested." She read every word carefully, twice, her lips moving slightly as she traced the sentences. Lydia Grant, 16, resident of Brookmere Lane. Samuel Reed, age 20, apprentice mechanic. Witnesses: none willing, police investigating possible jealousy. The weapon, a small kitchen knife, recovered nearby. "Kitchen knives," murmured Miss Marple softly. "So domestic, so ordinary. People seldom kill with things they don't understand." Outside, the day unfolded like any other. Children called to each other near the tram stop. A postman whistled. Yet beneath that hum of normality, Miss Marple felt something, a disquiet that had little to do with murder itself and everything to do with human nature. There was something in this case that did not fit into the tidy pattern of ordinary wickedness. She had seen envy, greed, revenge, even love twisted to cruelty. But this felt colder. A girl killed in a public street while 20 people watched, and none intervened. It wasn't only the murder that horrified her, it was the silence that had allowed it. She rose, straightened her shawl, and walked toward the mantelpiece where the newspaper's photograph, a grainy image of the lamplit street, showed a faint, dark patch near the curb. To most, it was nothing but ink and shadow. To Miss Marple, it was the first clue. By noon, the neighborhood of Brookmere Lane had transformed. The narrow street buzzed with gossip, speculation, and nervous curiosity. Reporters swarmed like flies, the constables paced wearily, their boots echoing on cobblestones. At number 12, Mrs. Penrose, who prided herself on knowing everyone's business, whispered to her neighbor through the railings that she'd heard the girl was seeing 2 boys at once. Dreadful modern thing. Across the way, old Mr. Cobb swore he'd heard nary a thing, but was later seen polishing his spectacles furiously as if to rub out a memory. Miss Marple arrived just after 1 o'clock, her grey coat buttoned against the thin London wind. She moved quietly among the onlookers, her face calm, her eyes bright and searching. The inspector in charge, Inspector Craddock, spotted her almost at once and sighed. "Miss Marple," he said, with the air of a man resigned to inevitability. "You have a gift for appearing at precisely the wrong moment." "On the contrary, Inspector," she replied with gentle precision. "I often find the right moment is when everyone believes the matter already settled." Craddock smiled despite himself. "You've read the reports, I suppose?" "I have, and I must say I find them rather efficient, almost too efficient." He frowned. "Too efficient?" "Yes. When everything fits neatly into place, I always suspect someone has been tidying up." She looked past him toward the street lamp. The pavement had been scrubbed, but a faint reddish stain still glimmered near the edge. "A tidy mind is a dangerous thing, Inspector. It forgets to leave room for truth." Craddock shook his head. "You'll make me superstitious, Miss Marple." "Oh, I do hope not," she said lightly. "Superstition clouds judgment. Observation sharpens it." As she walked slowly along the lane, Miss Marple noted details others ignored. The lamplight post still bore a faint smear where someone's hand had grasped it, perhaps to steady themselves or to strike. A single white button lay near the gutter, and on the doorstep of number 14 a cat sat watching her intently, its yellow eyes glimmering in the afternoon sun. Cats, she thought, often remembered more than humans. She paused, glancing upward. In a window above the butcher's shop, the curtain twitched slightly, then fell still. Someone had been watching. And somewhere, behind those clean pavements and nervous curtains, lay the truth of what really happened beneath the streetlight. Miss Marple turned away, her knitting bag hanging lightly from her arm. She smiled faintly to herself and murmured, "There's something dreadfully wrong with this story. And when something's wrong, my dear Raymond would say." It's the beginning of a book. Chapter 2. The Mechanic's Rage. The following morning broke pale and unsettled, the sort of London dawn that seemed half-hearted about daylight. A damp mist curled low across the rooftops, softening the outlines of chimneys and dulling the cry of the newspaper boy as he made his rounds. Inside Raymond West's house, the radio hummed faintly with morning news, but Miss Marple was already dressed, gloved, and standing by the front window with quiet purpose. "I thought," she said mildly to her nephew as he wandered sleepily into the room, "I might take a little walk this morning. The air looks quite bracing." Raymond, used to that particular tone of gentle understatement, peered over his cup of coffee. "You mean a walk to Brookmere Lane?" Miss Marple smiled. Well, my dear, one can hardly resist curiosity when the world is so determined to be mysterious. Besides, I rather fancy a stroll among the unhelpful. Unhelpful? Yes. People who saw nothing, heard nothing, and remembered everything incorrectly. They're most enlightening, if one listens properly. By 9:30, she was there. Brookmere Lane, in daylight, looked almost innocent, its narrow pavements washed clean by last night's drizzle, its houses prim and anxious under the pale sky. But the shadows lingered. Beneath the street lamp, the stone still bore a faint mark, like a bruise that the morning refused to hide. At the corner stood a small garage, its sign painted in uneven blue letters. Reed's Repairs, Motors and Cooling Systems. The paint was flaking, the windows were clouded with grease. From within came the sharp clatter of metal against metal and the faint hiss of a wrench. Miss Marple paused outside for a moment, observing the young man bent over a motorbike in the open doorway. His shirt was rolled up at the sleeves, showing lean, sinewed arms darkened by oil. His movements were brisk, almost too brisk. The rhythm of a man pretending to be calm. His jaw tightened when he noticed her. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "A fine day for engines, I should think." The boy straightened slowly. He had a narrow face, handsome in a way that would have softened easily into charm if not for the permanent tension behind his eyes. "You want something fixed, ma'am?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied lightly. "I haven't owned a motor in years. I'm visiting nearby and thought I might see the place where that dreadful business happened." His expression stiffened. "You mean the girl?" "Yes. Miss Lydia Grant, wasn't it? Such a pretty name, though I dare say she was even prettier in person." Samuel Reed wiped his hands on a rag, his gaze dropping to the pavement. "You shouldn't go asking about her. People talk too much already." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "And what do they say?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "That I'm the monster, that I killed her because I couldn't stand her leaving me." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "They've all made up their minds." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, I shouldn't say all. There are always a few who prefer facts to feelings. Inspector Craddock, for instance, rarely mistakes one for the other." The boy gave a bitter laugh. "Facts, eh? Facts are easy when you're not the one people already hate." She regarded him closely. Beneath the anger lay fear, raw, stifled, almost childish. "Tell me, Mr. Reed, did you and Miss Grant quarrel often?" His eyes flashed. We had our moments, like anyone. She was young, headstrong, thought she could handle everyone, even Jarrow." "Mr. Jarrow?" Miss Marple asked mildly, the name slipping into her knitting mind like a stitch caught on purpose. He looked up sharply, instantly regretting the mention. "Forget I said that." "Impossible, dear boy," said Miss Marple, smiling faintly. "My memory is rather like one of those dreadful sticky buns. Everything clings to it. Later, when she left the garage, the fog had lifted enough for the sunlight to reveal the faint sheen of oil on the pavement, a rainbow shimmer that caught Miss Marple's eye. She crouched delicately, adjusting her spectacles, and noticed something else. A small fragment of torn fabric, dark red, half buried near the drain. She lifted it carefully with her handkerchief. Silk. Women's silk, by the feel of it. She tucked it into her handbag. "No mechanic would wear that," she murmured. At the police station that afternoon, Inspector Craddock looked up from his paperwork as she entered. "Good heavens, Miss Marple, you do move quickly. I've only just finished taking Reed's statement." "Statements," she said mildly, "are rather like recipes. They tell you the ingredients, but never quite explain the flavor." Craddock chuckled. "You think he's lying?" "Not entirely. He's hiding, which is different." He frowned. "Hiding what?" "Possibly guilt," she said, "but not of murder. He reminds me very much of a young gardener I once knew in St. Mary Mead, strong, proud, and very foolish when frightened. He broke a greenhouse window one night and let another boy take the blame because he feared losing his position. The fear of punishment can make an honest boy dishonest, and a frightened one dangerous. Craddock leaned back in his chair, watching her. You think he's frightened? I know it, but not of the law. He's frightened of someone else. She lowered her voice. He mentioned a Mr. Jarrow. Craddock nodded grimly. We've heard of him. Calls himself a social worker, but everyone in Brookmere Lane knows he's more of a strong man. Keeps order, as he puts it, by intimidation. Supposedly helped Lydia once when Reed became violent. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. Helped her, did he? My dear Inspector, help from men like Mr. Jarrow tends to come with a bill attached. That evening, as dusk fell once more across London, Miss Marple sat by Raymond's fireplace, her knitting needles clicking softly in the glow. Outside, the city buzzed faintly, the rhythmic hum of buses, the laughter of late workers. She had the red silk fragment on the table before her, next to a teacup and a folded newspaper. A quarrel under a street lamp, she said quietly to herself. A frightened boy, a girl seeking protection, and a man who sells safety like a tradesman sells fear. The fire crackled gently. People imagine evil as something loud. A shout, a gun, a scream, she mused. But more often it whispers, it offers help, and smiles while it steals. Her needles paused. Lydia Grant, she murmured. What did you see, poor child, that made them all so afraid? Chapter 3. Lydia's Secrets. By the time the next morning stretched its pale fingers across London, the story of Lydia Grant had already begun to unravel, though not in the way Inspector Craddock imagined. The newspapers still blared the same neat narrative. Young mechanic kills girl in jealous rage. It was convenient, digestible, and suitably tragic, but convenience, Miss Marple often said, is the first refuge of the lazy mind. She sat that morning in a modest tea-room near the tram stop, her cup of Earl Grey cooling beside a plate of untouched scones. Through the window she watched the people of Brookmere Lane hurry past, postmen, shopgirls, mothers, tugging reluctant children. All faces carried the same expression, that peculiar blend of fascination and denial that follows a public crime. Opposite her sat Martha Jenkins, a slight, fair-haired girl with anxious eyes, and a handkerchief twisted nervously between her fingers. She had been one of Lydia's closest friends, and her voice trembled each time she spoke her name. She was lovely, miss, Martha whispered, always laughing, always so sure she could make things right for everyone. Even Sam? Samuel Reed? Miss Marple asked softly. Yes. She used to tell me he wasn't all bad, just angry. She said anger came easy to boys who felt small. She thought she could help him. Miss Marple stirred her tea, absently. And did she? Martha hesitated. For a while. He stopped drinking, got steadier at work. But then... She swallowed hard. Then he started getting jealous. About Peter. Peter Collins, Miss Marple supplied gently, the name resting on her tongue like a familiar melody. The former sweetheart, Martha nodded, colour draining from her cheeks. He was her first love, miss, everyone knew. They were together for years before Sam came along. Lydia even had his name tattooed on her wrist, in tiny letters. She used to hide it with her bracelet when Sam was around. I think he found out. That's when the shouting began. Miss Marple's eyes softened. Poor child, 16 is an age for dreams, not secrets. She tried to end things properly, Martha went on in a rush, as though afraid to stop. Told Sam it was over, but he wouldn't listen. He said she belonged to him, that if she spoke to Peter again, he'd kill them both. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Threats from a frightened man, one hears them too often, and yet most never mean them, unless someone whispers in their ear that they should. Martha frowned faintly. What do you mean? Oh, nothing, Miss Marple said lightly. Just an idle thought. Tell me, my dear, did Lydia ever mention seeking help from someone? The girl's eyes widened. You mean Mr. Jarrow? Miss Marple's knitting mind clicked quietly into place. Ah, yes, Mr. Jarrow, I've heard the name. What sort of help did he offer? He runs things around here, Martha said, cautiously. Helps people find jobs, settles fights. Some say he's kind, others say he's dangerous. Lydia went to him after Sam started threatening her. She said Mr. Jarrow promised to talk to him, to make him stop. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. And did he? Martha looked down. Sam came to see her 2 days later. He was white as a sheet. Said Jarrow had told him if he went near Lydia again, he'd regret it. Lydia said it was over after that. She looked relieved, but also scared. She started sleeping at my house most nights. The teacup in Miss Marple's hand paused halfway to her lips. Her expression, however, remained calm. Did she ever mention why she was afraid? No. She just said something like, "You don't get something for nothing with men like that." Miss Marple set her cup down quietly. Outside, the tram bell clanged through the street, scattering pigeons into the grey air. That afternoon, Miss Marple took another walk through Brookmere Lane, her eyes flicking from window to window, noting the closed curtains, the hurried footsteps, the whispered glances that followed her. There was a hush that lived in the air, not the hush of grief, but of complicity. She stopped outside number 7, a narrow house with a cracked step and a smell of tobacco drifting from within. According to Martha, this was where Peter Collins had once lodged before leaving for work in the Midlands. The landlord, a stout woman with a crimson shawl, answered the door with suspicion. "Peter Collins?" Miss Marple inquired, her tone as mild as her lace gloves. "Left months ago," the woman replied sharply. "Decent lad, paid his rent, never made trouble." "Did he visit recently?" The woman's eyes darted away. "Maybe. Once or twice. He came looking for the girl, didn't he? Asked after Lydia. Foolish of him, if you ask me. Got her killed, didn't he?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, my dear, causes are such slippery things. Sometimes the real one stands just behind the obvious." By dusk, the air had grown heavy again. A thin drizzle began to fall, soft as mist. Miss Marple sat on a bench near the very street lamp where Lydia had fallen, watching the glow quiver through the rain. A constable nodded politely as he passed, and she returned the gesture. Her thoughts wandered. To the frightened mechanic, the brave but foolish girl, the first lover with a ghost still inked on her wrist, and the unseen man who offered protection in exchange for silence. The pattern was forming, faint but unmistakable. She thought of Lydia's words to Martha. "You don't get something for nothing." "Indeed you don't," Miss Marple murmured under her breath. "Kindness is the most expensive currency in the world when bought from the wrong sort of man." A flash of lightning illuminated the wet street, followed by a distant rumble. In that momentary brightness, Miss Marple's eyes caught a detail she had missed before. The faint outline of a mark on the lamp-post, high up, shaped like a handprint smudged in oil and soot. She stood, leaned closer, and saw that within the smear a small piece of paper had been pressed tight by the damp. She drew it out delicately, unfolding it with gloved fingers. It was a torn note, the ink half washed away, but a few words remained legible. "Well, meet him alone. He's watching. P." Miss Marple's lips tightened. "So she knew she was being watched," she whispered. "And yet she came." She tucked the paper carefully into her bag. Above her, the streetlight flickered once more, as if winking in grim acknowledgement. That night, as she returned home, Raymond looked up from his typewriter, surprised. "Aunt Jane, you've been gone all day. Did you at least enjoy your walk?" Miss Marple removed her hat and smiled mildly. "Oh, yes, my dear, quite invigorating. One learns the most remarkable things when people believe one isn't listening." She sat by the fire, taking out her knitting and the damp scrap of paper, smoothing it gently beside her needles. "You know, Raymond," she said after a pause, "there's nothing quite so tragic as young love, except perhaps what grows around it when older men see how useful it can be." The clock on the mantel ticked softly. Rain beat against the windows, and in the flickering firelight, the red silk fragment from the previous day and the torn note now lay side by side. Two delicate threads in the web she was quietly beginning to weave. Chapter 4. A Whisper in the Alley. The morning after the rain came bright and brittle, the sort of sunlight that makes even sorrow look momentarily polished. Brookmere Lane, however, wore its guilt uneasily. The cobblestones still glistened faintly from the night's drizzle, and the air smelled faintly of iron and damp paper. Housewives leaned from their windows, gossiping with the careful curiosity of those who feared knowing too much. Miss Marple walked the length of the lane with her parasol open, not against rain, but as a shield against the world's staring eyes. Her footsteps were soft, deliberate, almost inaudible. She paused near the lamp-post, that tall, silent sentinel of violence, and watched the faint tremor of dust in the light. Then, turning, she made her way toward a small corner shop painted a tired shade of green. The bell above the door gave a fragile chime as she entered. Inside, the air was warm and slightly stale, with the mingled scents of tea, tobacco, and old sugar. Behind the counter stood Arthur Cobb, the grocer, a heavy man with kind eyes and nervous hands. His spectacles hung precariously at the end of his nose, and his apron bore the faint smudge of flour. "Good morning, Mr. Cobb," Miss Marple greeted cheerfully. "I do hope I'm not intruding. I heard you sell an excellent Darjeeling." Cobb blinked rapidly, the way men do when startled by courtesy. "Ah, yes, ma'am. Finest I've got. Won't find better this side of Kensington." He reached for a tin, his fingers fumbling slightly. "How much shall I put up for you?" "Oh, just enough for a few afternoons. I'm staying with my nephew nearby," she replied. "He writes novels, so tea is as necessary to him as ink." Her tone was conversational, but her eyes wandered to the window overlooking the street, the back door that led to the narrow alley behind the shop, and the faint crack in the wooden counter where someone's hand might have pressed too tightly. Cobb measured the tea mechanically. "Sad business, that girl," he muttered at last. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Indeed. Most dreadful. You must have known her." "Knew her to see, yes. Used to buy lemon drops, that one. Always said they tasted like sunshine." He gave a small, rueful smile. "Never thought—" He broke off, his voice thinning. "Were you here that evening?" Miss Marple asked gently. He nodded. "Closing up just after 8. I heard some voices outside, raised a bit but not shouting. Sounded like a lover's quarrel, so I thought best to mind my business." "Quite natural," said Miss Marple, her voice calm and grandmotherly. "We are, after all, told not to interfere in private affairs. And yet," she added softly, "it's strange how often private affairs become public tragedies." Cobb's throat bobbed. "I saw them from the window for a second." He grabbed her arm. She said something. I couldn't hear it all, but I caught a few words. "You don't understand." Sounded frightened, she did. I started toward the door, but... He swallowed hard. Then someone else came out of the alley, just a shadow at first. A man, tall in a dark coat. I thought maybe he was stepping in to help. The boy saw him and froze. Then it all went so fast, with the movement, the knife, the scream. Miss Marple's gloved fingers tightened imperceptibly on her parasol. "You saw the man's face?" "No, ma'am, only his outline. He didn't run, just turned and walked back into the alley. Calm as you please, like it was nothing." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And afterward?" I panicked, shut the blinds. By the time I looked again, she was on the ground. People were starting to gather. I told myself I hadn't seen enough to help. Fool that I am. His voice cracked under the weight of it. Miss Marple reached across the counter, her hand resting lightly on his wrist. "You're not a fool, Mr. Cobb. You're human. Fear often wears the same coat as reason." Her kindness undid him. His shoulders sagged as if a secret had been pried loose. "There's more," he whispered. "That man, the tall one, he wasn't a stranger. I've seen him before, down the lane. Talks big. keeps the lads in order, goes by the name of Jarrow." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened like a blade catching light. "Mr. Jarrow. Yes, his name does rather haunt the air here, doesn't it?" She accepted her packet of tea, thanked him warmly, and left the shop with her parasol tucked close. The alley behind Cobb's store was narrow and half-choked with rubbish, old crates, broken glass, the faint stink of spoiled fruit. A cat darted past her feet, vanishing into shadow. The walls leaned inward as though trying to keep secrets. Miss Marple moved carefully, her shoes silent against the damp stones. Halfway down, she found a discarded matchbook lying in a puddle. Its cover bore a logo in faded gilt, the Kingfisher Club, Soho. She turned it over thoughtfully. "Not quite the sort of place for a man who calls himself a helper of the poor," she murmured. At the far end of the alley, a side gate creaked slightly in the wind. Beyond it stood the rear entrance to Mr. Jarrow's so-called community office, a narrow building with barred windows and the faint hum of voices within. Miss Marple did not attempt to approach. She merely listened. Through the wood and iron she caught the rise and fall of a man's voice, low and commanding, and a nervous reply. "Don't worry," the man said distinctly. "The boy's already confessed. He won't change his story now." Miss Marple stepped back quietly, her pulse quickening. The gate shuddered again as the voices moved away. She stood still until the sound of footsteps faded into the hum of the street. Then she turned, her expression thoughtful. "A confession too early," she said under her breath, "and a witness too frightened. It's all beginning to smell of tidy conclusions." That evening, she visited Inspector Craddock once more. His office was lit by a single desk lamp, the walls lined with files and fatigue. He looked up as she entered, half smiling, half dreading what she might say. "You've been busy?" he said dryly. "Merely conversational, Inspector," she replied. "The sort of conversations that tend to make the truth blush." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "I take it you've found something." Miss Marple placed the damp matchbook on his desk. "I've found where your Mr. Jarrow likely spends his evenings. The Kingfisher Club, Soho, not precisely a parish hall." Craddock frowned. "Jarrow again? You think he's behind it?" "I think," said Miss Marple softly, "that men like him rarely lift a knife, but they are very good at finding someone who will." He sat back, studying her. "You have proof?" "Only patterns. And patterns, as you know, Inspector, are the footprints of human nature. If you follow them long enough, they always lead somewhere unpleasant." When she returned home that night, the fog had begun to settle once more, rolling over the rooftops in slow, silvery sheets. Raymond was asleep in his chair, the newspaper open across his knees. Miss Marple moved quietly to the window, drawing the curtain just enough to see the faint shimmer of the distant street lamp. For a moment, she thought of Lydia, her laughter, her fear, her final words. "You don't understand." "On the contrary, my dear," Miss Marple whispered to the glass, her breath fogging faintly upon it. "I understand rather too well. You weren't the only one standing under that light." She extinguished the lamp beside her, leaving only the faint glow from the fire. And in that half-darkness, the old lady's eyes gleamed with quiet certainty. The hunt, she knew, had truly begun. Chapter 5. The Protector of Brookmere Lane. The next morning dawned with deceptive clarity, a crisp blue sky stretched like glass over London, the sort of day that made even tragedy look momentarily civilized. But Brookmere Lane, for all its polished brightness, wore its shame like a bruise beneath powder. The gossip had grown sharper, the whispers thinner, and Miss Marple knew from long experience that such silence meant fear had begun to take root. She arrived in the lane at 10, her grey coat buttoned neatly, her handbag swinging lightly from her arm. To passers-by she looked like a harmless old lady out for errands. To those who knew her, she was a quiet storm, dressed in wool and lace. Her first stop was not the scene of the crime, but the narrow red brick building behind it, Jarrow's community office, as the fading sign declared. It stood between a pawnshop and a shuttered tailor's, a curious hybrid of charity and menace. The front window displayed a hand-painted notice that read, "Help when you need it. Jobs, advice, protection." "Protection?" Miss Marple murmured under her breath. "A useful word, and such a flexible one." She stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of tobacco, dust, and damp paperwork. A wooden desk stood near the entrance, stacked high with forms and leaflets. Behind it sat a young man in an ill-fitting suit, pale, jumpy, and chewing the inside of his cheek. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed, his eyes flicking instantly over her, dismissing, assessing, and then softening into polite indifference. "Good morning, madam. Are you here for assistance?" Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Not precisely, my dear. I heard such admirable things about Mr. Jarrow's good works, and I wondered if I might speak to him. I'm collecting information for a small parish paper, a piece on community efforts." The young man hesitated. "He's busy. People depend on him." "I quite understand," she said sweetly. "Good men usually are. Still, I can wait." Her patience was disarming. Within moments, the door behind the desk opened, and a man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a dark suit that strained slightly at the seams. His smile was generous but calculated, the kind that revealed just enough teeth to suggest confidence rather than kindness. His hair was slicked back with too much pomade, and his eyes, though friendly, carried the stillness of someone who weighed every word spoken near him. "Mrs. " he began. "Miss," she corrected gently. "Miss Marple. Such a pleasure, Mr. Jarrow. I've heard of your tireless service in this area. It must take real courage to do good work among such difficulties." Jarrow's lips twitched. "One does what one can. The authorities often overlook the poor. Someone has to keep order." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Order. So fragile, isn't it? Like porcelain. Once cracked, it rarely mends." He studied her closely, sensing something beneath her gentle tone that made him wary. "Was there something you wanted, Miss Marple?" "Oh, merely conversation," she replied. "I'm fond of hearing about kindness. It's such an old-fashioned virtue. Tell me, did you know the late Miss Lydia Grant?" For the briefest instant, the line of his jaw stiffened. Then he smiled again. "Tragic girl, foolish perhaps, mixed up with the wrong sort. I tried to help her, you know. Warned her to keep away from that Reed fellow, but you can't save everyone." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly, "you can't. But one must admire those who try. How thoughtful of you to involve yourself so personally." He gave a small laugh. "This neighborhood is mine to look after. People trust me." "Yes," she murmured. "I imagine they do, out of gratitude or necessity." There was something in her tone that made him frown, but before he could reply, the young clerk returned with a tray of tea. Jarrow gestured for her to sit. As they talked, Miss Marple allowed him to lead the conversation, and he did, eagerly. He spoke of his philanthropy, of keeping boys off the streets, of ensuring peace through his influence. Every word was polished, yet his manner betrayed something deeper, a hunger to be admired and a fear of being doubted. Miss Marple sipped her tea delicately. "You must have known Lydia well to take such an interest." He shrugged. "Knew her as one knows anyone here. She came to me frightened, said the boy had threatened her. I promised to warn him off." "And did you?" "I spoke to him," Jarrow said, leaning back. "Made him see reason. He's a hot-headed fool, that one. I told him if he so much as looked at the girl again, I'd break him." Miss Marple's eyes were bright behind her spectacles. "That was very firm of you. One hopes firmness achieved peace." He smiled too quickly. "I do my best." Miss Marple placed her cup gently upon its saucer. "And yet I hear the girl moved out of her home shortly after your conversation with Mr. Reed. That doesn't sound very peaceful, does it?" For a fraction of a second, the charm faltered. Then it returned, polished, anew. The young have strange ideas. They scare themselves. Perhaps she overreacted. Perhaps, Miss Marple said kindly. Or perhaps someone meant her to. He rose suddenly, signalling the interview was over. "You'll excuse me, Miss Marple, my time's rather occupied." "Of course, dear Mr. Jarrow. I do hope we'll speak again." Her voice was mild, but her eyes lingered on his cuff. A faint stain, reddish-brown, darkened near the seam. Not blood, she thought, too dull for that. Rust, perhaps, or the residue of something that had been wiped clean. Outside, the air felt colder. The street buzzed faintly with murmurs as she walked toward the grocer's corner. Arthur Cobb stood in his doorway, polishing apples with distracted precision. He looked up as she passed, his expression uncertain. "Did you see him?" he asked quietly. "Oh, yes," Miss Marple replied, pausing. "Quite the pillar of the community, the sort of man who reminds me terribly of a certain churchwarden we once had in St. Mary Mead, forever collecting donations that never quite reached their destination." Cobb gave a nervous laugh. "He's dangerous, miss. You be careful." Miss Marple smiled serenely. "At my age, Mr. Cobb, people rarely bother to be dangerous. They underestimate one instead. It's much safer." She moved on, but not far. In the narrow passage between two houses, she stopped and looked up at the second-floor window of Jarrow's office. The curtain had shifted slightly. A shape moved behind it, perhaps Jarrow himself, watching her. She inclined her head politely, as if acknowledging a bow, and walked away. That evening she returned to Raymond's house with an odd collection of thoughts. The red silk fragment, the torn note from Peter Collins, and now a faintly stained cuff. 3 clues from 3 lives that had collided beneath one street lamp. Raymond, intent on his manuscript, barely noticed her enter. "Another adventure, Aunt Jane?" She smiled faintly, removing her gloves. "One might call it that. Though I find adventures are usually what other people call inconveniences once you've survived them." He laughed. "You and your mysteries. Do you really think this one's not as it seems?" "My dear Raymond," she said, pouring herself tea, "when a crime seems simple, it's almost always the result of someone's careful editing. And Mr. Jarrow, I think, is a very tidy man." She took a thoughtful sip, her eyes distant. "The question is," she murmured, "did he tidy before or after the girl's death?" The fire crackled softly, throwing long, trembling shadows on the wallpaper. Outside, a tram bell rang faintly in the fog, echoing down the silent lane. Miss Marple sat very still, knitting resting on her lap, as her mind worked. Quiet, relentless, precise. And somewhere in Brookmere Lane, a man who called himself a protector locked his door against the night, unaware that an elderly woman from St. Mary Mead had already begun to unmake his careful world, one thread at a time. Chapter 6. The Street of Closed Windows. Morning settled over Brookmere Lane with a crisp, indifferent shine, as though the sun had been polished and rehung. The houses, freshly rinsed by the night's mist, looked demure and well-behaved, yet their windows, every sash and pane, sat tightly shut, like lips that had agreed overnight to say nothing at all. Miss Marple came early, a grey figure with tidy gloves and a parasol that ticked softly against the pavement. She did not go first to the street lamp. She went to the doors, the ordinary doors behind which extraordinary cowardice, kindness and compromise tend to share tea. The first knock was at number 3, Mrs. Penrose's neat little kingdom of geraniums and grievance. Mrs. Penrose opened to a spill of lavender air and suspicion. "Good morning," Miss Marple said, the phrase fresh as a folded napkin. "I thought I might inquire after your poor nerves. Such a shock to the neighbourhood." Mrs. Penrose thawed at once. "A disgrace, miss, an absolute disgrace. I told Mr. Penrose that very night. 'You'll see,' I said, 'nothing good ever happens under that lamp after 8 o'clock.'" "How sensible of you," Miss Marple murmured, stepping inside as if invited. She admired the crocheted antimacassars, the caged canary, the thin seam of dust on the mantel, details that tell the truth when people do not. And the windows? I notice they are so nicely kept, tightly closed. Mrs. Penrose flushed. The fog, you know, the soot. Of course, Miss Marple smiled kindly, and one hears less too with windows shut. That can be a comfort. Mrs. Penrose's mouth puckered, then straightened. I did hear something, muffled. A young voice, hers, I think. You don't understand. And a man saying, I do, girl, not the boy, a man, older. She shivered delicately. There, that is all. All, Miss Marple said, as if it were plenty. Thank you, my dear. She went next to number 10, a basement flat that smelled of starch and damp iron. Mrs. Fitch, the laundress, worked her mangle with punishing, rhythmic purpose. I won't be dragged into it, Mrs. Fitch declared before Miss Marple had spoken. We keep to ourselves. How very wise, Miss Marple agreed. And how very difficult when other people's linen keeps arriving at your door. Mrs. Fitch's eyes sharpened. She wrung out a shirt front with unnecessary zeal. People give what they give. I wash what I'm paid to wash. Blood is a dreadful nuisance on cuffs, Miss Marple said conversationally, turning her parasol. Rust is worse. The mangle paused. Mrs. Fitch's jaw shifted. Rusted radiator at the community office, if you please, left a smear on a gentleman's sleeve. She met Miss Marple's gaze squarely. I know blood when I see it. This was not. How practical of you. Miss Marple inclined her head. And the gentleman? Mrs. Fitch pushed the mangle again. Brought in by that clerk of his. The big one's name is Jarrow. The clerk's is Rafe. Shaky lad. Spills buttons. Buttons, Miss Marple repeated mildly, remembering the solitary white disk she'd seen near the gutter on the first day. How they do wander. By 10 o'clock, the lane had warmed into its customary bustle. Miss Marple counted open doors and shut curtains like beads. Number 5 open, child's laughter. Number 7 shut, a shape behind lace, the butcher's propped ajar to let out the righteous smell of sawdust and brine. She bought a paper bag of bullseyes she did not need, and a slice of cold pork she did not intend to eat. One must carry purchases when one appears to be out for ordinary errands. At the grocer's, Arthur Cobb was polishing apples with the same guilty diligence as before. Mr. Cobb, Miss Marple said softly, if a person wished to watch the street without being noticed, from where would one best do it? He looked at the window, then away. The alley, ma'am, halfway down. There's a broken plank in the fence, makes a slit. You can see the lamp and the pavement and not be seen at all. How very useful, Miss Marple murmured, as if discussing string. And a person taller than average would have no difficulty? None, he said hoarsely. None at all. She thanked him and left. She did not go down the alley at once. Instead, she seated herself on the bench opposite the lamp, quiet, unthreatening, plainly visible. Pigeons tottered, a bus sighed. Presently a small boy with a scuffed cap and the hopeful air of the perpetually hungry sidled near and regarded her with dramatic indifference. Bullseye? Miss Marple offered, as if struck by a sudden reckless generosity. The boy's eyes lit and then, very properly, narrowed. Mum says sweets rot your teeth. Quite right, Miss Marple agreed gravely, which is why it is essential to eat them before one grows any older. I am beyond help, perhaps you are not. This admirable logic conquered him. He pocketed 2, then produced from his own pocket a treasure wrapped in greasy paper, a small silver locket speckled with grit. Childhood is a market. He began to haggle without speaking. How pretty, Miss Marple said, as if she had only just noticed it. Did you find it? He nodded, pleased by her admiration. In the drain gully, miss, there, by the lamp. After the coppers washed it, I put me hand down where the muck is. Proper clever, Mum says. I should think so. Miss Marple's voice was soft with honest wonder. May I look? He considered, then exchanged it for the entire bag of bullseyes with a magnanimity that suggested he had practiced this exchange in daydreams for years. The locket lay cool in her palm, dulled but not ruined. A hinge bent. She pressed it gently with the nail of her little finger. It opened with a reluctant click. Inside, beneath a skin of dried water, a photograph stared back. Lydia, laughing, head tipped, cheek pressed trustingly against a young man whose face was angled toward her rather than the camera. He was older, 20s, dark-haired, with that careless, handsome look that follows money and the kind of safety that money buys. His arm was around her shoulders with an unselfconscious certainty boys seldom possess. On the opposite leaf, in tiny engraved script, were two initials intertwined, L and L. Miss Marple did not move for a long, precise second. The street shuffled past her. A tram bell rang. Somewhere a door slammed with the brittle sound of a secret shutting. Two L's, Lydia and Leonard, Lionel, Lawrence. The human mind likes pleasing symmetry. Men who build little empires often name their sons after themselves. Lucas Jarrow, Leonard Jarrow. She saw again the faint stain on Mr. Jarrow's cuff, the clerk named Rafe, the matchbook from the Kingfisher Club. Clubs have lists. Lists have sons. "Thank you," she told the boy. "You have done something very important today." He beamed with the delighted alarm of a child who suspects he may have committed a virtue by accident and ran off to boast of his sugar. Miss Marple closed the locket and weighed it delicately in her palm. It had been lost in flight, or dropped in haste, or wrenched from a neck in a moment that wanted no jewellery. The hinge had been bent by pressure, not time. Someone had tried to snap it shut quickly and failed. She rose and crossed to the street lamp, kneeling with the careful, unfussy dignity of an elderly woman accustomed to gardens and their obstinate weeds. The gully beside the lamp showed the recent disturbance of mud. The iron grate bore, caught in one seam, a solitary black hair that had not belonged to Lydia. Coarser, thicker. She took it up with a folded scrap of newspaper, tucked it into her bag, and stood. Window by window, the lane continued its performance of normal life. 114, curtain moved, retired. The butcher's, boy laughed too loudly. The office window above Jarrow's premises, shade at half-mast, a silhouette that pretended to be a hat stand until it shifted fractionally and remembered it was a man. Miss Marple paid a call on Inspector Craddock at 2 o'clock. He was in shirt-sleeves, wilting over paperwork, like a flower that had mistaken a desk lamp for the sun. He brightened and bristled in the same instant when he saw her, relief struggling with resignation. "You have brought me something," he said, with the grim optimism of a man hoping for tea and expecting dynamite. "Something small?" Miss Marple allowed, and placed the locket on his blotter. He opened it, brows rising. L and L? "Lydia and someone whose name begins conveniently with the same letter," Miss Marple said. "Someone older, someone who wears good suits and poor conscience." "Peter Collins?" he tried, but without conviction. "No," Miss Marple said gently. "Mr. Collins is a first love. Sweet, ill-advised, inexpensive. This is older, more confident, and very likely inconveniently connected to Mr. Jarrow." Craddock sat back. "You think Jarrow's boy?" "I do not think yet." She smiled thinly. "I worry." "Which is more useful?" "Worry asks how a locket engraved L and L leaves a girl's neck to drown in a gutter in front of the only lamp on the lane while every window shuts itself like an eye going suddenly to sleep." Craddock turned the locket over. The back bore scratches, recent, irregular, as though someone had tried to scrape away a mark. "We'll check births and baptism," he said. "Leonard? Lionel? Lawrence? If Jarrow has a son of that name—" "You will not find that son in parish notices," Miss Marple said, almost kindly. "Men who sell protection keep their true treasures under different names. Try club ledgers, motor registries, and the sort of photographic studios that enjoy saying no questions asked, as long as the money is counted properly." She paused. "Also, Inspector, speak again to the grocer. He has remembered something and is ashamed of having remembered it." "Shame is a locked drawer full of excellent evidence." Craddock gave her a long look. "You're not guessing, Miss Marple. You're arranging." "I'm gardening," she corrected, Pull a weed here, the root moves over there. One must see how beds connect. She stood, gathering her handbag. And do be careful of Samuel Reed. Someone has tidied his life into a confession. Boys confess easily when they are certain the story has already been told. When she left the station, the afternoon was sliding toward a pearl-coloured dusk. Brookmere Lane had resumed its whispering. Miss Marple walked it slowly, letting the air talk to her in smells and scuffs and the faint metallic tang that lingers where fear has recently stood. At the mouth of the alley, she paused and stared at the broken plank in the fence. Through the slit, the street lamp gazed back like a weary eye. She put her own eye to the gap, briefly, politely, like a lady peeking at a painting, and saw, reflected in the lamp's glass, the faintest suggestion of a figure in the upstairs window above Jarrow's office, watching the watcher. She withdrew and smiled her smallest, sharpest smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Jarrow," she said to the air. "And good afternoon to your L, whichever one he is." On her way home, she stopped by the Kingfisher Club, not to go in, but to read its brass plate and observe the men who drifted in at 4 with the heavy purpose of those whose evenings begin where other people's decency ends. One young man, dark-haired, well-cut coat, walked with a swagger that had not yet learned caution. He lit a cigarette with a match struck against the club's stone, an elegant little act of vandalism, and turned his face for a second. Handsome, careless, the sort of mouth that believed it would always be forgiven. Miss Marple did not follow. She had never yet caught a fish by jumping into the river. She simply memorized the angle of his cheekbones and the way his wrist watched a gold watch as though it were in on the joke. That night, by Raymond's fire, she laid out her small trophies. The red silk fragment, the torn note, "Don't meet him alone. He's watching." P, the coarse dark hair, the locket marked L and L. 4 neat, ordinary things. 4 whispered contradictions of the tidy story everyone preferred. Raymond looked up from his manuscript. "You have the look, Aunt Jane." "Which look is that, dear?" she asked, threading wool with efficient fingers. "The look you get when the last piece hasn't quite clicked, but you know the drawer it lives in." "How observant," she said, and her eyes warmed. "Yes. The drawer is marked families, sons. Families always tidy too soon. It is the reason secrets grow mould." She set her knitting aside, folded her hands and listened to the house breathe. Somewhere far off, a train sighed, and London rearranged itself for evening. In the soft, ticking silence, Miss Marple spoke almost to herself. "The windows were closed," she said, "but someone watched. He watched and waited, and when she fell, he dropped what tied him to her." She touched the locket with a fingertip, almost tenderly. "Tomorrow," she said, "we shall ask the street to open its windows." Chapter 7. A False Confession. The following day arrived with a sky the colour of pewter, and an air so still that even the sparrows seemed hesitant to chirp. Brookmere Lane had fallen into a peculiar quiet, a kind of watchfulness that made Miss Marple think of a classroom after a teacher's sudden question. Everyone pretending not to know the answer. At the police station, Inspector Craddock paced behind his desk, a telegram in hand. He looked up as Miss Marple entered, brisk and composed as ever, her umbrella neatly furled, her gloves immaculate. "Samuel Reed has confessed," he said, without preamble. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, as though he had announced the price of fish. "Confessed? How punctual of him." Craddock snorted. "You sound unimpressed." "My dear Inspector," she said mildly, "young men rarely confess to the right things, but often to the things they think they deserve. A fine distinction, but an important one." He passed her the statement. It was a single page, written in a jagged hand that betrayed exhaustion more than guilt. The words were simple. "I killed Lydia Grant. She said she was leaving me. I lost my head." No flourish, no attempt at self-pity, only the flat, dull tone of defeat. Miss Marple read it twice. "Did he ask for a solicitor?" "He refused," Craddock said there was no point." "Yes," she murmured. "Convenience again? You and I, Inspector, have been here before. The story fits too easily." She tapped the paper with a gloved finger. The human heart, in my experience, is rarely so tidy. She visited Samuel that afternoon in the detention wing. The room was narrow, smelling faintly of disinfectant and despair. He sat on the cot, head bowed, hands folded between his knees. When he looked up, his eyes were raw with sleeplessness. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reed," Miss Marple said gently. "May I sit?" He blinked, confused, then nodded. She perched primly on the chair opposite, setting her handbag on her lap as if she were calling on a distant cousin. "I hear you've been very brave," she began softly. "Confessing to a dreadful deed takes courage, or guilt, or fear." He looked away. "I'm not brave. I did it." "Did you?" Her tone was kind, not skeptical. "Tell me how." He swallowed. "She said she didn't love me, said she was seeing someone else. I followed her. I had the knife. It was in my pocket from work. He broke off, trembling. "After that, it's all a blur." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "Dear me, such a convenient blur." He glanced up, startled. "You see," she continued, "people seldom forget what frightens them. You remember the argument, the words, even the knife, but nothing of the act itself. That suggests something else, Mr. Reed." "Perhaps you remember too much that doesn't belong to you." He frowned. "I don't understand." "Precisely," Miss Marple said softly. "Neither did Lydia. Her last words were, 'You don't understand.' Do you suppose she meant you?" His lips parted, but no answer came. After a moment he whispered, "There was someone else there. I thought I imagined it. A shadow in the alley. He spoke to me before it happened." "What did he say?" "He said, 'She deserves it.'" The boy's voice cracked. "I turned, and then, I don't remember, just blood." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew a handkerchief embroidered with tiny violets, offering it to him. "Memory is like embroidery, Mr. Reed. One pulls the wrong thread and the whole picture changes. Think carefully before you let someone else do the unpicking." That evening, Miss Marple called on Inspector Craddock once again. The rain had begun in earnest now, blurring the gaslight outside the station windows into molten amber. She set a small envelope on his desk. Inside lay a coarse black hair, the torn scrap of Peter Collins's note, and the silver locket. "You may file these where you like," she said. "I believe they belong to the same story, though not the one we're being told." Craddock leaned forward. "Go on." "Mr. Jarrow," she began calmly, "is not simply a man of influence. He is a father to a son named Leonard Jarrow, dark-haired, handsome, fond of Soho clubs and the sort of entertainment that prefers its guests too young to complain. Our Lydia was drawn into his orbit. When she tried to leave, Leonard became possessive." Craddock's face hardened. "You think he killed her?" "No," Miss Marple said, "but I think he watched her die, and his father arranged the rest." She told him what Samuel had said. The shadow, the voice, the words, "She deserves it." When she finished, Craddock sat in silence, his fingers drumming the blotter. "It's possible," he admitted slowly. "Too possible." "It's human," she corrected gently. "Mr. Jarrow would not soil his own hands. He would use another's fear, a frightened boy, a jealous quarrel end as the weapon. And then he would close the windows." Craddock sighed. "You mean everyone on that street is lying?" "Oh, not lying, Inspector, merely surviving. It is an old pastime in every neighbourhood ruled by a bully." Later that night, Miss Marple stood again beneath the infamous lamp. The rain had eased into a fine drizzle, silvering the pavement. She tilted her head, watching the light ripple across the wet cobbles like the memory of fire. From an upstairs window came the faint scratch of a violin, a melancholy tune that drifted down like a sigh. She took a small notebook from her handbag and wrote, neatly, "Truth seldom shouts. It waits until the tidy stories collapse under their own weight." Then she tore the page free and folded it beside the locket. Tomorrow she would return to Craddock with one last suggestion. A gathering. In the open. Beneath the light where everything had begun. Behind her, a curtain shifted. The watcher in Jarrow's office, perhaps the father, perhaps the son, stood motionless, his outline blurred by the glow. Miss Marple saw it and smiled slightly, a smile that belonged to a woman who has already placed every piece upon the board. "The game is almost over," she whispered to the night, "and daylight is not kind to ghosts." Chapter 8. Murder. Beneath the Streetlight. Evening returned to Brookmere Lane as though retracing its own steps. The air carried a nervous hush. The lamp, the same lamp that had watched Lydia die, flickered uncertainly in the mist. Under its thin golden halo, chairs had been arranged in a careful half-circle. The inspector, his constables, a few reluctant witnesses, and Miss Marple herself composed and unhurried, like a hostess preparing to conclude a long and rather unfortunate dinner. It was nearly 7 when Mr. Jarrow arrived. He came with his usual composure, hat tipped, coat immaculate, that faint smirk of a man who has always managed to stay one move ahead. Behind him, in the car's dim interior, Miss Marple glimpsed a young man, dark-haired, handsome, and visibly uneasy. He followed, adjusting his cufflinks with trembling hands. "Inspector," Jarrow said smoothly, "this had better be necessary. My son's health isn't strong." Craddock's expression remained politely blank. "Necessary, yes. Comfortable, perhaps not." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly upon her lap. "Mr. Jarrow, Leonard," she said gently, "how kind of you both to come. I should so like to finish what poor Lydia began." Jarrow's eyes narrowed. "And what, pray, was that?" "The truth," said Miss Marple softly. "It's a dreadful thing, isn't it? Always shows up late to the party, but never without a proper entrance." A ripple of unease passed through the small group. Somewhere down the lane, a shutter banged. Miss Marple rose slowly, turning toward the lamp. The light hummed faintly, moths circling in thin, desperate spirals. "We are standing," she said, "precisely where Lydia Grant died, and every one of you, Mr. Jarrow, Mr. Reed, Mr. Cobb, and even you, Spectre, believed you already knew how, but stories, you see, are like sewing patterns, one missed stitch, and the whole thing unravels." She looked at Samuel Reed, who stood pale and silent at the edge of the circle. "You confessed, my dear boy, not to murder, but to despair. That's a very different sin. You believed you killed Lydia, because she fell while your hands were raised. But the knife that entered her chest was not yours. It was already waiting in her coat." Samuel's lips parted. "In her... what?" "Yes, someone placed it there beforehand." Miss Marple's tone was steady, almost conversational. "The blade was too clean, too dry, to have come from your workshop that evening. You were meant to find it, meant to hold it when the quarrel came. You were, as the saying goes, the perfect tool." Craddock frowned. "Planted? But who—" "Patience, Inspector. It is a rather delicate embroidery." She turned to Jarrow, whose smile had become taut. Lydia Grant had become inconvenient. She knew too much about Mr. Jarrow's real business, about certain exchanges of money and favours, about a photograph taken at a club in Soho. A girl like Lydia, clever but soft-hearted, would threaten exposure not for gain, but for conscience. That made her dangerous. Jarrow laughed once, without mirth. "Pure fantasy, you've no proof." Miss Marple produced the silver locket, gleaming dully in the lamplight. "Oh, but I do hate to disappoint. Inside, Lydia kept this photograph, of herself and your son, Leonard. The initials engraved on the back are L and L, Lydia and Leonard. She loved him, you see, foolishly perhaps, enough to meet him that night beneath this very lamp, even after she'd been warned not to." All eyes turned to the young man beside Jarrow. Leonard's face had gone bloodless. "That's a lie," he whispered. "Oh, I wish it were," Miss Marple replied gently. "But lies don't tremble quite so convincingly, Mr. Jarrow. Your father discovered the affair, didn't he? It threatened everything, your position, his reputation. So he intervened, not by forbidding it, but by ending it. He arranged the meeting himself, told Lydia that Leonard wished to see her once more. He then followed her here, bringing the frightened Samuel Reed behind, knowing a quarrel would bloom like clockwork. And when the quarrel reached its breaking point, her voice fell to a whisper. He struck, quick, practiced, efficient. The knife went in before Samuel even realized what had happened. Then he stepped back, melted into the alley, and let the boy's shock do the rest. Craddock's breath left him audibly. "You're saying Jarrow killed her himself?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, and then silenced the witnesses with the same weapon he's used for years, fear. "Mr. Cobb, you saw a tall figure walk calmly into the alley." Mrs. Penrose heard an older voice say, "I do, girl." Mrs. Fitch laundered a sleeve that bore a brownish stain Mr. Jarrow called rust. Rust does not turn crimson when wet, Inspector. A gasp rose among the listeners. Leonard's head dropped into his hands. "Father, please—" "Enough," Jarrow barked. "You've no evidence." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed behind her spectacles. "Oh, but I think I do. You see, you forgot one witness, Mr. Jarrow. The street lamp." He stared at her. "What nonsense!" "Not nonsense, sciencey." Her voice was mild. "The constable who cleaned the pavement noticed smudges on the lamp's glass. Finger marks, yours, I suspect. You steadied yourself against it when you struck. We've since compared the prints to your office cup, an exact match." The colour drained from his face. "You called yourself a protector," Miss Marple said softly. "And so you were, protecting your name, your son, your empire of small fears. But protection bought with blood is merely another kind of corruption." For a long moment, no one moved. The lane seemed to hold its breath. Then Leonard stepped forward, voice breaking. "It's true, he told me she'd gone abroad. I didn't know." Jarrow turned toward him in fury. "Be quiet, you fool!" But the constables were already moving. The clink of handcuffs sounded indecently loud beneath the humming lamp. Later, when the others had gone and the lane lay quiet again, Miss Marple stood alone beneath the streetlight. The glow was softer now, steadier, as if the lamp itself had found relief. Rain glistened faintly on the cobbles. She looked down at the spot where Lydia had fallen, and for a moment her expression softened into something like sorrow. "Poor child," she murmured. "You saw what others refused to, and you paid for it. But perhaps," she added almost to herself, "the world is a fraction kinder tonight." She turned toward Inspector Craddock, who lingered nearby, his hat in hand. "You knew from the start, didn't you?" he asked quietly. "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied with a faint smile. "I merely suspected from the moment everyone agreed. Agreement is such a suspicious thing, Inspector. It usually means someone clever has arranged it." He chuckled wearily. "You'll make London nervous, Miss Marple." "Then London will be safer," she said. The tram bells sounded distantly, echoing along the wet stones. Miss Marple took one last look at the lamp, the quiet witness that had seen everything and said nothing, and walked away into the thinning fog, her figure small but unshakably upright. Behind her, Brookmere Lane exhaled at last, and above, the old streetlight burned on, no longer flickering but steady, as though determined, at last, to keep its watch properly.